David Stilwell was the United States Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs from 2019 until January 2021. As the United States' top diplomat in the region, he knows intimately how the Chinese Communist Party's influence and interference operations are at play in the Pacific and why this region is so crucial for Beijing's expansion. He joins me now live in an exclusive interview. David Stilwell, welcome to the program and thank you very much for your time this evening.
Sherry, it's good to be back in touch.
Look, I want to start with a specific question about the Solomon Islands and the security pact that has just been signed, that has dominated our news agenda over the past few weeks, but before we move on to China's ambitions more broadly. My sources tell me that there were bribes paid to senior Solomon Island ministers to the tune of millions of dollars. Is this a modus operandi of the Chinese Communist Party that you're aware of and that you were aware of when you were Assistant Secretary of State?
Absolutely. We called it elite capture. It's kind of a nicer way of saying bribes, but it is one way, and it's a very effective way. Instead of having to deal with the population, you deal with the people making the decisions, and you leave the populace behind. But when it happens, it catches up eventually. Word gets out, and when the people find out that their leaders are basically selling out their interests for their own personal benefit, well, we see what happened with the 1MDB in Malaysia. Najib was caught, and he was voted out, and a change of government. So people who do these things will, I think, eventually be shown the door.
How large are some of the bribes that we're speaking about here? Can you give us a figure, a ballpark figure? How many millions of dollars are paid to individual politicians?
Well, we heard the Malaysia leadership mentioning $1 million. In November of 2019, 60 Minutes did a tour of some of the Pacific Islands, Solomon Islands being one, and that number was also bandied about. So, one of the bigger problems, though, Sherry, is the intelligence community needs to do a better job of following the money. They need to go. This data is very easily found out and published, and I would love to hear from ASIO and from U.S. agencies exactly who's getting paid and how. We know what that is. I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, look, my sources tell me that in the case of the Solomon Island ministers, that some of them were paid, and you ask about following the money and the method, that some of this was to offshore bank accounts. Is that something that you, again, were aware of in your experience in this region?
Let me give an example. In 2017, Bloomberg broke a story on casinos in the island of Saipan, an island of, I think, 40,000 people, and there was $8 billion in gambling going on there, being basically laundered. And that was being laundered through Hong Kong banks. That is one modus operandi that we're very familiar with. And so, and this happens not just with China, there's all sorts of offshore banking globally. But I think, again, if we just investigate this, again, if you read the Bloomberg article on Saipan, it was a very easy solution. You just simply, as John Garneau says, shine a little sunlight on it, and all the cockroaches go scattering back under the furniture. So highlight these things, provide some detail that people can understand, and the problems tend to go away.
Just returning to the specifics of the Solomon Islands and this security pact that has just been signed with Beijing. This has been in the works for quite a while, for reportedly a couple of years. Are you aware in this specific instance of bribes being paid to ministers? And, was this a security deal that you were concerned about when you were still in the role as America's top diplomat in the Asia-Pacific region?
I think if you read the letter from Micronesian President David Panuelo, when he does a very good job of describing how the PRC works in these, and it was a very well written letter. Again, it gives you an idea of how the PRC insinuates itself into these places. He talked about stalking horses like free security or glowing words about environmental cooperation, fisheries, and all that stuff, when we know the opposite is true. Panuelo actually asked the ministers or the leaders of the Pacific Islands to read the climate Paris climate data, read the agreement, and look at what China signed up to. And his point was that China's commitment to carbon neutrality in 2060 will be long after we're all dead. Therefore, how are you going to hold them to that? So, the methods are pretty obvious. And again, that letter from Panuelo is worth looking at because he lays them out pretty clearly.
Yeah. Look, this has been a very big political issue in Australia in the past month, particularly leading up to our federal election, which was just on last weekend. The Labor Party that is now in government blamed the former Morrison government for not doing enough on climate change, which you just raised then, and not doing enough in terms of aid funding, to giving enough to the Pacific Island nations to stop China's engagement and investment and the security deals and setting up future military bases in these places. Is this Australia's fault, do you think?
Not at all. What are we going to do? Are we going to out-China the Chinese? Are we going to double down on their bribes? These are sovereign nations. These are, they can do what they want, even though they know there are multiple examples of how this goes badly. Pakistan's probably my favorite, with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. There's lots of stories from Africa and otherwise that the Chinese are nothing if not predictable. You'll see this same process executing almost in the exact same way every time.
So how do we counter it? How does the United States, Australia, the UK, Japan, India, how do we counter this sort of financial influence, these sort of bribes?
As I said before, once you expose them and you show that leaders who are elected, and most of these countries are democratic, once these leaders are shown that they're elected leaders showing that they prefer themselves and their own benefit over their people's, they are bounced out of office fairly quickly. And again, Malaysia is an example. There are others.
Yeah.
So transparency.
What is China's end game in the Pacific? Why is it set on signing these 10 or even a dozen security deals?
Well, I know Jim Fennell mentioned this before, that they've laid this out in their Belt Road strategy, that they have all these lines of communication they're trying to protect, South China Sea being their primary, but this is a secondary area of concern. They're also going after places where U.S. And Australian and allies relations are maybe tentative, and when they see weakness, where they see the possible opportunity to drive wedges between relationships, they do that quite well. This is part of their concept of winning without fighting, is you create angst and friction between partners.
Yes.
And when they're done, fighting, you walk in.
And is the next phase in this Pacific, is it military expansion? Is this what Xi Jinping hopes to do, set up military bases in places like the Solomon Islands so close to Australia?
I hope he does. I think that's great, because those are military assets that are no longer in the South China Sea or the East China Sea directly.
Not great for
Taiwan.
Australia, though, too close to us.
I don't see Chinese military assets coming after Australia. I see them falling back in defense of their own lands, of Taiwan particularly, or the South China Sea. So, this is strategic overextension. This is overreach. This is, look at the amount of bribes, money, investment they've got globally. And then you look at the debt situation inside China, and you can't do all of those things at once. I think you're going to see a rapid retrenchment of at least Chinese investment, real estate investment everywhere. We're already starting to see it here in Hawaii and elsewhere, that they got to get liquid so they can pay debts back home. Again, I think in 2015 we saw peak China. We're now watching it actually happen.
Okay, just back to climate change, a point you raised just a moment ago. The Pacific Island leaders say that they want Australia to take more action on climate change, and this is kind of bandied about as a reason or as an excuse that deals are being signed with China, or that there's more engagement with China. But as you point out, China is one of the world's largest carbon emitters. So is this a nonsense argument?
Well, it is, but it doesn't have to be a rational argument. It's just simply throwing stuff at a wall and see what sticks, right? And they know that the folks in the West are very conscious of our reputation. We like to be seen as treated people fairly, which we do. And if you look at what our countries have done as far as reducing emissions and aligning with our commitments to the climate. I live in Hawaii. I live about 6 feet above sea level. I care deeply about making sure this doesn't get worse. And I know a lot of people do. You look at words and actions, and this is where, again, we have it all over Beijing, is, let's look at the Solomon Islands Agreement. We talked about climate. Let's talk about other agreements. In the Solomon Islands, China committed to preserving the Solomon Islands' sovereignty and territorial integrity. That happened with Ukraine too in 2011 and 2013. And yet when push came to shove, did China live up to its agreement to protect Ukraine sovereignty and territorial integrity? No, it did not. And so again, we put the Chinese actions on climate against the words, yes, and let the facts speak for themselves.
Look, before you'd go, David Stilwell, I'd love your quick take on US politics. You obviously worked very closely with Mike Pompeo when you were Assistant Secretary of State and he was Secretary of State. Do you think he would make a good presidential candidate, or do you expect Donald Trump will run again?
35 years in the military makes me the worst possible person to ask that question. I mean, I'm serious. The military has always taken a vow of nonpartisanship. You can't have a partisan military. I will tell you that Mike Pompeo was a fantastic leader. I loved working for the guy. He was clear. He loved to delegate, right? Tell you to do this and then come back to me if you need help. And he gave us a lot of latitude to get a lot of stuff done. I think he'd make a great president. But there are a number of other candidates that would do just as well. It's a clear vision, and the ability to execute it is what you need as the leader of the free world.
Yeah. David Stilwell, I really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you. It was great.